To seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 3783 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
H.R. 3783, a bill to provide for a comprehensive strategy to counter Iran's growing presence and hostile activity in the Western Hemisphere and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. ROS-LEHTINEN, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material into the record on this measure.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I yield myself such time as I may consider.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support today of H.R. 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012, a bill introduced by my good friend, Mr. Duncan, an esteemed member of our Foreign Affairs Committee. I would like to thank him for his hard work on the issues addressed in this important bill. In February, the Committee on Foreign Affairs held a hearing entitled Ahmadinejad's Tour of Tyrants and Iran's Agenda in the Western Hemisphere in order to examine the threat to U.S. national security posed by Iran and Iranian-sponsored activities in the Western Hemisphere. 1 month later, this bipartisan measure was unanimously adopted by our Committee on Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, as we have witnessed in the last few weeks, the violence perpetrated by extremists in the Middle East against our embassies and our consulates undermines our foreign policy objectives, and we must prevent these vicious attacks from occurring in our region. Let us not forget that 18 years ago, Iranian so-called diplomats readily partnered with Hezbollah, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, to carry out a deadly attack against the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Iran has only increased its subversive actions since then, and over the past decade, the regime has increased diplomatic and economic ties between Iran and the radical regimes in Latin America. Iran's Ahmadinejad made 2 trips to Latin America this year to visit his fellow tyrants, the Castro brothers in Cuba, Ortega in Nicaragua, Correa in Ecuador, Chavez in Venezuela, and Morales in Bolivia. In an attempt to promote its extremist propaganda, the Iranian regime recently launched a Spanish television network to reach a larger international audience centered in the Western Hemisphere. More embassies and cultural centers have opened in Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Colombia, Chile, and Uruguay, in addition to its existing diplomatic missions in Cuba, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. According to a U.S. intelligence analyst, these diplomatic missions are simply fronts for Iran to carry out its nefarious activities in the region and a potential platform to increase the presence of the Quds Force operatives, a designated foreign terrorist organization and an arm of the Revolutionary Guard of Iran. According to media reports, Hezbollah, which is Iran's proxy, has established a training base in Nicaragua. It is also concerning that the Ortega regime in Nicaragua does not require any visas for Iranian officials to enter the country, which can then become the gateway to enter the United States through our southern border. 10 days ago, there were news reports stating that several alleged Hezbollah members were arrested in Mexico. Iran has worked tirelessly to promote its extremist ideologies and support efforts to undermine the democratic governments throughout the region. H.R. 3783 requires the Secretary of State to outline a U.S. government-wide strategy to fight the aggressive actions of Iran and its proxies, such as Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere, toward a comprehensive policy stance that will protect U.S. security interests. This legislation also calls for the administration to develop a plan to secure the U.S. borders with Canada and Mexico and prevent operatives from entering the United States. It also calls for a plan to isolate Iran and its proxies from their source of financial support and addresses efforts by foreign persons, entities, and governments in the region that may be assisting Iran in evading sanctions. And lastly, it also develops a plan to protect U.S. interests and assets in our Western Hemisphere, including embassies, consulates, businesses, and cultural organizations. We must ensure that the United States is actively monitoring this threat and takes appropriate steps to counter the Iranian regime's agenda in our hemisphere. I strongly support passage of this legislation, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentlelady's time is reserved. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012, and I'd like to thank the sponsor of this legislation, Mr. Duncan, and the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. ROS-LEHTINEN, for their leadership on this issue. This bill makes available $1 million of Andean counter-narcotics funding for the State Department to generate an assessment of the challenge posed to our country by Iran's present and hostile activity in the Western Hemisphere, as well as a strategy to address whatever threats we may face from the Iranian regime. Tehran's pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability, its continued support for international terrorism, and its abuse of basic human rights require the United States to maintain extreme vigilance in monitoring and countering its threats around the world. Though our goal has not yet been realized, thanks to the leadership of Congress and the Obama administration, more pressure has been placed on the Iranian regime than ever before. While Iran's behavior poses a clear and obvious danger to its own people, its neighbors, and to our ally Israel, its presence closer to our shores also deserves watchful attention. The Foreign Affairs Committee has heard significant testimony on this issue from both administration and private sources. And in my capacity of first chairman and now ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think there is ample evidence that Iran is up to no good in the Western Hemisphere. Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has openly and defiantly signaled to the U.S. in his 6 trips to our hemisphere that he is trolling for friends. Although it seems what Iran actually places on the table of the countries he visits is a stack of unmet promises, it is important that the U.S. government remain vigilant and dig much deeper into the nature and effectiveness of these Iranian regime actions. None of this occurs in a vacuum. Iran was complicit in the horrific bombings of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires and the Amia Jewish Community Center, also in Buenos Aires, which I have visited on numerous occasions. This happened in the first half of the 1990s, so it can easily be said that the first terrorist attacks on Latin American soil happened with Iran in control. And we have evidence of Iran's increasing willingness to conduct an attack on U.S. soil, such as the discovery this year of a twisted Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. We must be alert to any Iranian attempts to circumvent sanctions and stand against efforts to curry favor with our neighbors to loosen those sanctions. We should continue to monitor intelligence links and watch the Iranian diplomatic corps, given its historical involvement in nefarious acts. We should keep a close eye on financial transactions, the chaotic nexus of drug money and terrorism in this region. In particular, this deserves serious notice. Finally, it's important to express that my support for this legislation is not in any way an indication that the Obama administration has not taken this issue seriously. The President has himself stated that his administration will continue to monitor Iran's activities in the Western Hemisphere closely, and I have personally engaged enough administration officials to be persuaded that they understand the gravity of the situation and are giving it the attention it deserves. Still, we must be particularly vigilant towards the relationship between Iran and Venezuela, given the opacity of the ties between the regimes governing each country and the anti-American bombast of their leaders. However, there are some positive notes in our region. I would like to extend my appreciation to Brazil the largest democracy in the hemisphere outside of the United States, which has significantly cooled its relationship with Iran under President Rousseff and has cast important votes in the UN Human Rights Council critical of the Iranian regime. Today's polarization and bluster in Washington on so many issues can have the effect of making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. We cannot let that happen here. The stakes are too high. So with this legislation, we provide both a strong signal to the administration to continue to monitor this situation closely, as well as the resources to look across U.S. agency efforts and enforcement capabilities to make sure they are in lockstep. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
This time, gentlelady from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I proudly yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, a member of our House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Homeland Security, and Natural Resources Committees, but more importantly, the author of this bill today. Thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for your leadership on this very important issue. I want to pause to thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for his leadership on the other side of the aisle. Last week, Congress took a rare break from our work here and from partisanship. We came together to remember those who died on 9/11 and during the war on terrorism. We stood together on the Capitol steps and we pledged that we would never forget the heartbreaking events of that fateful day. One of the ways we can honor the memory of those who lost their lives is to be prepared, so that our country will never again experience such a tragedy. Mr. Speaker, that's why I'm standing before you today, thanking you for putting, and the members of the body for putting partisanship aside and working together to keep our families and our communities safe from new and emerging threats to our nation. We're all aware of the Iranian nuclear threat in the Middle East and globally. But there's another potential threat from Iran and its proxies closer to home. That threat is an emerging Iranian-backed terror network here in the Western Hemisphere. What we already know is very alarming. We know about last October's foiled Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the U.S. here on American soil. We know that Iran has vastly expanded its diplomatic and economic footprint in Latin America. For example, we know about the Department of Defense 2012 annual report on Iran that stated that during the past 3 decades, Iran has methodically cultivated a network of sponsored terrorist surrogates capable of targeting U.S. and Israeli interests. Just this month, a Brazilian journal, Beja, and others reported on a police seizure in Bolivia of 2 tons of minerals believed initially to contain uranium, but more likely tantalum, the mineral that is in demand for, and among other things, nuclear reactors and missile parts. We know that 2 weeks ago, an Israeli news organization revealed that Iran has established Hezbollah terrorist training base in northern Nicaragua, with operatives being trained at the base to attack Israeli and U.S. targets in the event of a raid on Iranian nuclear installations. And we know that just last week, press reports revealed that 3 suspected Hezbollah members were arrested just south of our border in Mexico. None of this should come as a surprise. Iran has publicly stated that increasing their presence and ties to Latin America is one of their top foreign policy objectives. However, we must have the capabilities to defend ourselves from potential Iranian attacks here on the homeland. We must be able to clearly identify this emerging threat and develop strategies which include working with our neighbors here in this hemisphere to prevent Iran from being a danger to our country here at home. Mr. Speaker, that's why this bill 3783 establishes a strong U.S. posture, policy, and relationship with Latin American countries. It protects U.S. interests and assets in the Western Hemisphere, such as embassies, consulates, businesses, energy pipelines, and cultural organizations, including threats to U.S. allies. It addresses the vital national security interests of the United States by ensuring that energy supplies from Western Hemisphere are free from the influence of any foreign government that would attempt to manipulate or disrupt global energy markets. This bill requires a secure U.S. border, with the U.S. working in coordinations with governments of Mexico and Canada to prevent Iranian operatives from entering the United States. This bill counters efforts by foreign persons, entities, and governments in the region which may assist Iran in evading U.S. and international sanctions. Mr. Speaker and Madam Chairwoman, I urge that members of this body come together and vote for this very important issue, H.R. 3783. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 4 minutes to my friend and colleague from the great state of New York, who is the lead Democratic sponsor of this bill, Mr. Higgins, for 4 minutes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to thank for his leadership and friendship on this issue, Jeff Duncan, for his hard work on this, and it's a very important bill that obviously enjoys bipartisan support. I rise in support of H.R. 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act. This important legislation is of particular interest to Western New York, and it addresses a pressing national security concern for the United States. Mr. Speaker, Hezbollah, otherwise known as the Party of God in Arabic, is a militant Shia organization committed to violent jihad. It is based in Lebanon but serves as a proxy for Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. During hearings in the House Committee on Homeland Security, we heard expert testimony linking Hezbollah to criminal activity throughout the Western Hemisphere. We learned that there are roughly 80 Hezbollah operatives in the 15-nation region of Latin America, and that it is involved in South American drug trade and radicalization efforts in Mexico. We also learned that Hezbollah has an active presence in 4 cities in Canada, in 15 cities in the United States. I questioned the witnesses about Hezbollah's activity in North America. I asked, if Hezbollah is not targeting the United States, what are they doing here? The response was that these activities were not significant because they were largely limited to fundraising. Mr. Speaker, I don't see the distinction between terrorist activity and fundraising for terrorist activity. If Hezbollah, and by proxy Iran, are using safe havens in and around the United States, we must have a strategy to address it. As I said, this is a particular concern to Western New York because one of the communities in which Hezbollah has a presence is Toronto, which is 90 miles north of Buffalo. The Buffalo-Niagara region is within 500 miles of 55% of the United States population and 62% of the Canadian population. Our Peace Bridge is the busiest border crossing between the United States and Canada. Our Niagara Power Project is the largest energy producer in New York State. And the Department of Homeland Security, citing budgetary constraints, just dropped our preparedness funding. You can understand if we don't feel comfortable with Hezbollah 90 miles away for those who live in Buffalo. Mr. Speaker, this bill would address the threat Hezbollah poses to communities like mine. It requires the State Department to conduct a thorough assessment of the threats we face and to develop a strategy in coordination with our allies and partners in the region to address Hezbollah's growing presence and activity in the Western Hemisphere. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Jeff Duncan, for his work on this issue and his leadership on this issue. I also want to thank Chairwoman ROS-LEHTINEN and Ranking Member Berman for their support. I urge passage of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Turner, a member on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security Committees.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from South Carolina for introducing this resolution. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 3783, the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act. Last week's events in the Middle East and Africa are a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be. Iran's leaders have not been afraid to let the world know they will attack the United States and our allies, even going so far as to claim that they will wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Iran is emerging as a threat much closer to our shores in South America. Earlier this year, Iran's President, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, embarked on a trip that Chairman ROS-LEHTINEN accurately characterized as a tour of tyrants. He traveled throughout South America, where he met with Venezuela's President Chavez and attended the presidential inauguration of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua before going on to Cuba and Ecuador. Iran continues to deepen its relations with Latin America through its ties to the international Islamic Shia group Hezbollah, a State Department-designated foreign terrorist organization. According to the Congressional Research Center, Hezbollah, along with Iran, has been linked to 2 bombings against Jewish targets in Argentina, the 1972 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires that killed 30 people, and the 1994 bombing of the Argentine-Israeli Mutual Association in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people. While increasing tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran, we cannot simply afford to ignore the threats that are looming in South America. The Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012 will ensure that threat assessments are conducted, that a cooperative strategy is put in place between the United States and our allies in the region, and our borders with Canada and Mexico are more secure. These efforts will allow our country to better protect our citizens and our interests both on our own soil and abroad. As we have seen, the threat is real and American lives are at stake. We cannot afford to ignore the potential threats to our national security that may stem from this area of the world. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from New York.
At this time, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
I condemn all the violence that has been talked about here, and also had the opportunity years ago to visit the synagogue in Buenos Aires that was the subject of that attack, and paid my respects. I want to say that as I've heard this debate, there's 2 things that occur to me. Number one, Congress has a right to ask for reports. It's our constitutional obligation to find out what the administration is doing. So I support Congress's right to get information. But at the same time, when the debate takes us in a direction to where suddenly we're at odds with Latin America, it is an argument for Congress to take a strong stand for diplomacy. And I hope that as we get these reports that we're going to underscore the importance of diplomacy, not only with respect to Latin America, but also with respect to Iran. The American people do not want another war, and we need diplomacy to take us in a direction that makes war not likely. Thank you.
Gentlelady from Florida.
I will reserve the balance of our time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentleman from New York.
I have no further speakers, so I will yield back the balance of my
Gentleman
time.
yields back his time. Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We also have no further requests for time, and we yield back the balance of our time.
Gentlelady yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3783 as amended? Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended.